We want to add something new. So we've talked a little bit about the data sources or sources for their context, where the coding agents would obviously use a GitHub repo, for example. They may use tools like Obsidian and a few others where the actual data are files residing on your laptop or workstation. Enterprise data sources come from all over the place, but fundamentally, they are governed data sources, whether the database, standard operating procedures, stuff on a Google Drive or whatever, but they're governed resources. And that drives a whole fundamental difference in terms of how you manage those.
Hey, good to see you again, Eric. Long time no see.
Yeah, likewise, John. I guess you're back in San Francisco now.
Yes, and we've been having all kinds of audio problems with our podcast recording. So, yes, it's good to be back, and it's great to be talking about the next topic that has been coming up with a lot of coming up in a lot of client conversations I've been party to, and it's been coming up in several of the meetups I've been attending here. And people referred me back to an OpenAI paper, and the topic was about this idea of a harness. And OpenAI has developed a harness for long running agent processes, something that, we've been doing in Anthropic for a while, but I think it was around February when Codex came out with this paper, and it kind of changed the way we were talking about using Codex at the meetup, the Codex meetup for that matter. So, yeah, that's our topic for this week. Do you want to start by sharing how you think about the term harness and define it for us as well?
Yeah, sure. So I think this terms sounds relatively recent, especially in the agent harness context, but it's been around for quite a while. I mean, if you think about horses have a harness, in that in that agricultural context, I suppose this is the stuff that is around the horse that allows it to pull a plow or move in the direction that we want. Bringing it back to technology, back in the day, we used to have API harnesses. And what
Yeah.
the API harness did is it allowed that individual API to actually communicate in a rich, robust, and reliable way with other APIs, the infrastructure. Now, when we apply that to agents and the agent harness, I think the meaning is almost identical. Obviously, the context is different when you have APIs versus agents, but ultimately it is the runtime system that is around the model that
Yeah.
allows the agent to do what it's supposed to do. It manages, it controls the agent, obviously. So there's a control plane element to it. It manages state and long running conversations, perhaps. It provides access to tools, a reliable runtime environment, and a whole bunch of other things. But it's everything around that model that lets the agent do its thing, John.
Okay. So, and I know the terminology from the olden days when we talked about a testing harness around the application. And so, yeah, it's a commonly used term. And I like you that you bring it back to API harness and service harness, which isn't a word you used, but that's your background. I mean, I remember when we were doing our work a decade or so ago, maybe it's been longer. Uh, your experience in bringing that sort of total ecosystem view was really important. And when I look at the Agentic Mesh book, and this isn't just about the book, but it feels like a lot of what we're talking about and have been talking about
Yeah,
is very
absolutely.
relatable.
Absolutely. So if all the things that I mentioned, by the way, are
Yeah,
in the book. Now, this is not a plug necessarily for the book, just to recognize the fact that we've thought about this in a fair amount of detail. I mean, we've
yeah,
talked about, the control plane in the book. We talked about long running conversations and state in the book. We talked about tool management and access to tools, and a whole bunch of other things that effectively we called ecosystem services, or enterprise grade capabilities around a specific agent. And I think they are near identical in terms of what we have, but there is one difference, and this is probably I
Okay.
just want to kind of highlight this, and this may set the stage for some of our conversation. The context for and if you read about this, whether it's Anthropic or OpenAI or others, the Lang chain guys, what they the context they use it for is for coding agents or personal agents, OpenClaw, for example, if you want to call it that. But the tools, the capability, the runtime environment is all around your local computer. When we think of agents, in particular enterprise agents, we're going to increase the scope to the agents that run in an enterprise, the agents that are full participants in a process. All of a sudden, these agents don't run on a single workstation or laptop. They run in the on the cloud or in a data center. And where a coding agent, that harness may give you the resources and permissions and capability that are specific to that user that's using it. In the enterprise world, these things are ambient. They're running in the background. They don't have a user interface. They may have user interaction, but not in the same way. So they have stable identities, stable roles, and permissions and capabilities associated with that role. So that there is a difference in the context and how it's actually being used. No pun intended on that
Yeah,
context
I
word, by
know.
the way.
Well, you're using the word context, and I think it is confusing when you use it. So let's try not to. I'm not a school teacher here, but what what I think is important is that for me, when I think about this from the perspective of data and enterprise interactions and the agentic process automation we've been talking about and the knowledge fabric, it feels like this concept of a harness in the coding sense doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about the context window. And that's my hypothesis. I mean, I've only looked at a couple of papers, and it feels like everybody's solving for long running agents that are building code. And, what are your thoughts about that? Do you
Yeah.
agree or yeah, teach me.
Well, again, I unfortunately overused the word context, but let me kind of switch it around a bit. The data that fills the context window on a personal or a coding agent is typically local to that machine. So it may give you access, for example, to files on your computer. It may store files on your computer. It may provide access to tools like your email and such like that. Now, I'm trivializing a bit because these things are very powerful. We love these things. But here's the thing. The difference, though, is the data that populates the context for an enterprise agent is enterprise data. It may be the
Right.
standard operating procedures. It may be access to the account database or the customer database or Salesforce or the like. So the idea of filling the context for the agent is the same. It's just very, very different data, and that has huge implications. So I mentioned, kind of touched on it here, but if I'm running these coding agents on my machine, and they're using my identity and the capabilities I bestow upon them, then I've taken accountability for that, and I recognize that I'm sharing my identity, my capabilities broadly with agents, and I have ultimately responsibility for what they do. In the enterprise world, if these agents are working in the background in a business process, the user actually has no real bearing on what the agent actually does. They may issue a request, but the identity of that user has very little bearing necessarily on what the identity and the authorizations of the actual agent. So there's a big difference in how you manage identity, authorizations, roles, and privileges in terms of how you're doing. So that's just one small piece of the puzzle.
Okay. So let me just try to say that back in plain English. I think what you're saying, and I say that just to clarify and allow myself to be a little silly and try to reframe it. But I think what you're saying is that when I'm a developer working on my laptop, there's a bunch of things I like access to my local file system, Git repos, and other things that I will grant access to. And that's what you do as a developer. And you're controlling the scope. The boundary is just some code that you're working on. Whereas if you're an enterprise, if you're an employee at an enterprise and you've specifically granted an agent access to do something on its behalf, it's working for you. And so that delegation of authority to see things is either controlled by the employee or the developer. And they both can be employees, but we're differentiating between an enterprise agent and a coding agent. And I think that's that first sort of delineation between what do you give it access to. And then I think the second part is that, as you're saying, coding agents have sub agents that do a bunch of work. Business agents or enterprise agents have sub agents that do work on behalf of that uh, human being. And so that span of control and what it needs to have access to is similar but different. And part of the difference is that it's really has to understand the business, and it gets back into that conversation we had last week about the knowledge fabric. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So data is one element of the difference, or the data that they consume and they use. But I want to kind of anchor to their actual primary purpose, I suppose. So you kind of touched on it, but these coding agent, personal agents, they're individual productivity tools. And obviously they work in your operating environment, be it a PC, a laptop. Enterprise agents, very, very different. They operate as part of a business process. They're governed by the enterprise as opposed to what an individual may say it can or can't do. So that's, I think, the very first one. But that has an implication on the operating model. So the operating model is relatively simple for a coding agent. It's like whatever I ask it to do, it's going to go do. And if I let it have permissions to do certain things, it will actually be able to do that. The human guidance is the key there. When we're talking about the enterprise agents and the harness that supports them, these agents are ambient. They're in the background. They're headless. They are typically event driven. They may get direction from a human or a person that issues a request to open an account or otherwise. More often than not, though, they're going to be interacting with other agents and other systems, but they are not attached to a user interface. So the operating model is actually quite different, and that has huge implications for how you design these things and what type of workload you actually may want to give them, John.
Okay, so let's refine my model. A developer is using coding agents, and that's the span of control. And I was talking about let's say a creative that's using an agent to make some creative or an image or some videos. That's a human controlled agent. Okay. And that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about where an agent is actually supporting a business process that might not have been initiated by a human directly. So, for example, I think the perfect example of the simplest agent is the one that's watching for emails, right? So an email arrives, the agent looks at the email, looks at the content of the email and the attachments, and can go execute a business process. There was no human in the loop in that example of what you're calling a headless or an ambient agent. It's just something running in the background. And so that makes a lot of sense that that agent running in the background is going to need more context than or different context than what is needed by the coding agent. And hopefully that simplifies at least that part of our discussion about the difference between, a human directed set of agents and human-directed business agent or background business process. And we've been talking a lot about agentic process automations, but I wanted to make that clarification because we started to talk about agent evaluation a few weeks ago. And it's really important for people to remember that there are things we do with AI that we are intentionally keeping the human in the loop versus expecting it to be automated. And that allows us to understand the risk associated with agents as well. Um, yeah, that was a useful explanation for me to understand what you were saying, but that wasn't everything. Did you want to expand on some of the other topics around the harness?
Yeah, in the spirit of the discussion here, what I'm going to try and do is clearly delineate what a coding or personal agent does vis-a-vis its harness and what it needs. But I want to explicitly contrast that to the enterprise agent, because I think that's the core of the discussion and kind of the opinionated perspective that we would actually have on this. There's a lot of stuff on the agent harness, but almost all of it focuses on those personal or coding agents. We want to add something new. So that's why
Yeah.
I'm going to kind of, in the
Yeah.
discussion
Yeah.
here, I want to kind of contrast the two. So we've talked a little bit about the data sources or sources for their context, where the coding agents would obviously use a GitHub repo, for example, but they may use tools like Obsidian and a few others where the actual data are files residing on your laptop or workstation. Enterprise data sources come from all over the place, but fundamentally they are governed data sources, whether the database, standard operating procedures, stuff on a Google Drive or whatever, but they're governed resources. And that drives a whole fundamental difference in terms of how you manage those. Now, the other one I want to talk a little bit about is state management. So enterprise code and the close cousin is long running conversations.
Okay,
Go
so
ahead.
now
Go ahead.
okay, so you can so state management. What do you mean in a practical sense? What you mean by state management and long-running conversations? Because I think this is really important for people to grasp as they think about business processes.
Yeah, coding agents today can do very long running tasks. When I use the coding agents, I'm a convert to these things now, and I've been using them for quite a while. Well, is relatively short period of time in the grand scheme of things, but the last 6 weeks I've been using them quite heavily. Now, here's the thing: is I can ask an agent to do something, and you'll see it gives you a little bit of breakdown as what it's doing, what it's thinking, what it's working on. And sometimes those tasks take anywhere from 15 minutes to half hour, I think is the longest one I've had, but they can run longer. In order to do that, they need to keep track of where they are in their thinking. So typically you say, give me a plan. Here's the 7 steps I want to take, and then it goes through them one by one. If it forgets something or your terminal session breaks, whatever the case may be, you want to have the ability to restart where you left off. So if you do that well and properly, what you have is you manage that state, you persist the state, you recognize where you're at, and you restart and recover from where you were. That's relatively simple on a laptop or a workstation. When you're talking about the enterprise and where agents collaborate with each other to open up a bank account, which could take a fair amount of time and require interacting with a whole bunch of people and a whole bunch of different agents, that could easily take a few days, especially if you're talking about a complex, well, not a simple one, but a complex bank account open may take days to actually get complete. Along that way, you're issuing transactions to open up a bank account, maybe put money into a bank account. The state management is not about the files that in the specific conversation that an individual has, but the conversations across all the agents that participate in a conversation that may take a minute or may take a day or even a week. And there's different ways that you actually manage that state. State management within the enterprise typically occurs in a database, a rich, robust, enterprise grade database. That type of thing may not be needed with coding agents. In fact, very few environments would actually require that. But in an enterprise, that's table stakes. So long running conversations de facto across both. What happens in those conversations is very different, and how I manage the state is very different in the enterprise versus the coding or personal agents, John.
Yeah. Okay. And that makes sense to me because we've been talking about it a lot. But to break it down, is that when you work with a coding agent, and not everybody has, but there used to be a planning mode and a building mode where you would do some planning with the agent. That was the default in Claude Code. You'd do some planning, and then once you'd agreed the plan, it would go do it. Now it does so much of that for you. There's really no line between planning and doing, yeah, in Claude Code these days, but most of the coding agents have those two modes. But if the plan you built takes hours or days to execute, then you need to keep track of where you are on that plan. And one of the most beautiful and simplest things about coding agents is that everything's a file. So we just store a file of where we are in the plan. I've even seen people put little tick marks and get the agent to write these files in a specific directory to keep track of where it's at. And I've seen all kinds of fun solutions for that. And the reason people had to roll their own or build their own state management is because it's still not particularly great with any of the coding agents. And I'm sure they're probably better than I remember because I haven't used them in 4 weeks, but they're not great. But they've solved the problem largely for some of the reliability issues that happens in a long running coding assignment. And what you're saying is that that is also true in a complex multi-step business process, right? Like bank account open. We talked about this the other day. It's like, well, what's the first step? You have to identify who that person is. Do they have some sort of government ID that proves that that's the person? It's all part of that KYC or know your customer part of the bank account open. And so that typical process can complete in a short amount of time. Sometimes it takes longer. And so if the bank account open process fails in the middle of KYC or some other of the ongoing steps, you have to design a way for the agents to know where it left off and resume. And although that might sound really trivial to those that are listening to us talk about where the state of agents are, but that's a problem that's been solved in other ways before agents that is sort of being rediscovered as a clear problem of state management in long running enterprise agent processes.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other point related to that, John, is the impact of a step failing
Yeah.
on a coding agent is maybe I just ask, I look at the screen, I say, I don't like that, fix this up, fix that up. Dude, it's a local change and the blast radius is very, very small. When you have enterprise agents and they're collaborating to, for example, open up a bank account, if a step fails and doesn't get restarted, there could be some pretty big implications. If it tried to put the initial deposit into the bank account and it didn't work, but the customer seems to think it did, that's a big implication. So the blast radius in an enterprise business process is non-trivial and could be actually catastrophic if it's not managed well. So the notion of conversation management is common between the two, but they're
Yeah.
done differently based on the requirements and needs of the specific instance.
Yes, exactly. And okay, so I think we've landed that concept around state. Was there something else that you wanted to talk about as when we think about the harness?
Yeah, I think the other piece of the puzzle that is important, not as important necessarily on the coding edge, but is crucial in the enterprise side, is this notion of identity. And again, as we mentioned earlier, in a coding or personal agent, the identity is the person doing the work and the fact that I've given access to my Gmail or whatever the case may be. So the agent operates under your own identity. Um, on the enterprise side, though, these identities are core to things like observability or discoverability. If I don't have a persistent, stable agent identity, then, which is not a user, because as we've said earlier, these agents are background, they're not tied to a user. So they have their own stable, persistent identity. And that means they have a life cycle. They get onboarded. There might be some performance management evaluation, which we talked about in the previous episode, and they actually may be retired or retrained, to use that term. The bottom line is the ability to manage identity is fundamental to finding the agent in an enterprise. It's fundamental to allowing them to interact and find each other. And it's fundamental to actually being able to monitor and observe what the agent's doing. That is a huge difference that needs to be planned for when you're thinking about the agent harness in the enterprise, John.
Yeah, no, no, no. Now we're getting into some cool stuff because what you're saying is very important that because a business process typically involves the handoff between separate people, or in this case, agents, that you need to know that agent 123 is still agent 123 if you go back over the logs, you know, 7 years from now or 6 years from now, whenever the regulatory compliance window is for that audit trail. You need to know what was agent 123, what was it, which agent did it, what was it allowed to do. And so I think that, and I don't want to call it a license plate, but that unique identifier, let's just call it a unique identifier for the agent is important, and it needs to be stable over time. Because I can imagine the young, and there's nobody out there that's would make this mistake, but they would reuse IDs, and that would be the end of traceability. And so I see this often when people are assigning unique IDs when they're developing code for the first time. They create logging systems, and they burn down the code and they forget to reset the IDs, and so they repeatedly use the same ID number, and it's a very common mistake. It's a small mistake, but we can't get it wrong with agents. We need to have that unique identifier, and that has to be unique and immutable, and not reused. And that's just one piece of what you were saying, because not only do you need that, do you want to jump in and add something to that?
Well, I think I just want to build on what you said is the identity gives you now the ability to do discovery. Agents can now find each other. People can find agents. It gives you observability and traceability. What did that agent do? It lets me actually tie individual discrete requests into broader conversations by understanding who is actually talking to who. Those are fundamentals in the enterprise.
Okay, but now let's take it back to something we talked about in the months ago, which was this notion of an agent card. So, an agent card, as I recall, as defined by the A2A spec from Google, was did it enforce constraints around identifiers, or is that am I thinking too much like a data guy? Because data guys are all about unique identifiers. I'm not sure software engineers think about it as much as we do.
Yeah, I think the spec is 8A spec is I think version 1 just came out in draft recently or finally got published. So it's
Yeah.
changing over time. So what I say today may be different tomorrow, but the
Yeah.
agent card does or the spec mandates that you do have a unique identifier, an ID. With that ID, you provide a stable, presumably stable purpose and description so that the agent can be found using a textual way. But once it's found, that agent can now be, you can be confident that that agent is the agent that I'm actually looking for. So the modern specs do actually mandate that, because that is the foundation upon which you build OAuth 2 capabilities, for example, or role-based access control. Once you have the identity, you can confer roles. Once you have roles, you can confer permissions. So it's foundational in the modern agent spec.
Okay, I just want to pick on one of the things you said because now's the time to talk about it, not, 4 months ago. Is that the name? How do you name your agent? What do you call it? Naming conventions are one of the big challenges in our industry and in the world. It and I love how you say, yeah, once you find it, but wait, findability and retrievability is part of what we were talking about when we talk about knowledge management is also a challenge when people use different vocabularies, different conventions to identify their agents. And what this reminds me of is there was a post this morning on X. Somebody had created a little tool with a SQLite database so that you could register your individual clods running on your machine, all with a different name, so that it was a messaging protocol between the agents so that your Claude codes could collaborate on a coding job. And it was so beautifully simple and but also infinitely naive that that would be a good thing to do because it just the experiments we run can be good, but they don't
Yeah.
they're dangerous in production
Well, so
or
I've
anywhere
seen,
else.
yeah, I've seen people, anthropomorphize, whatever the word is,
Yes,
anthropomorph, more.
anthropomorphize.
There you go.
Anthropomorphize.
Yeah, apply human characteristics to it, and they name
Yeah,
their agent Harry or
yeah,
Lily or whatever the case may be. That is fine when all your agents are running on your local machine and you don't have hundreds of them
yeah,
that you need to keep track of. In the enterprise, we're going to see millions of agents. And
yeah,
that means you need to have a very consistent, coherent, and logical naming scheme. Now, fortunately, there's a lot of examples out there that we
yeah,
can, work with. For example, we could do something that is similar to internet naming conventions. Brodergroupsoftware.com. Um, there's a whole bunch of things that you can actually leverage. The bottom line, though, is you need to have a global namespace that is, well, global in your world, um, and be able to ensure that identities are for agents are unique within that global namespace. There's a bunch of different ways you can do it, but fundamentally, that's the requirement that you actually have to meet, John.
yeah. Well, and I look forward to that day where the senior executive is saying, "Hey, man, what happened to Bob version 73?" You know, whatever that agent is that we're depending on for a rigorous business process, how do we talk about it? How do we refer to it? And I think as systems engineers or systems designers that are building agentic systems, the only thing I would say is let's come up with a naming convention that's aligned to anything else in the enterprise. And so, what I typically do when I'm helping people set up data platforms is dude, I don't care what it is, but let's just have it for our cloud resources, our storage containers, our RBAC rules. Let's at least formalize it so that there's a chance, a year from now, we'll remember why we came up with this naming convention because I think it's easy to build something once. The expensive part of software is keeping it running over time. It's significantly harder to do that. But
Yeah, absolutely,
but I'm
absolutely.
I'm rambling. We've covered a lot of this. Is there anything else we wanna cover?
Yeah, well, there's two things I still want to cover. They're
Sure.
both kind of related, but they revolve around the security model and the implications of the security model. But let me take one step above that and give an example. why this is so important. We've talked about identity, and that's the foundation for the security model. But there's more to it. So let's talk about tool access. So on a coding agent, we've talked about it already a little bit. Is it works under my identity, and
Yeah.
whatever I give it access to is what it's allowed to use. But almost all coding agents have access to some capabilities that we may never actually give to an enterprise agent. So they can all access Bash and execute Bash commands. They can access the local file system. Typically, they can access a browser, and they can actually do things with the browser. Under your ID, of course, they can execute code. They can create Python code and then actually execute it. They can access the web. Some people I've even seen they can actually invoke payments. So
Yes.
so these tools are very rich and comprehensive. And if you're giving your agent those capabilities on your in your personal agent or your coding agent, that's your responsibility and your accountability, and you're taking account for that. In the enterprise world, tool access is completely different.
Right.
Access to tools is rigorously guarded and rigorously enforced. So if you want to access the bank account open API, there's a rigorous set of permissions and capabilities and roles that you actually have. These things, so I'll cut it off there, but suffice to say the access model is very, very different in the enterprise. And what you can do on your local machine is not what you can do in the enterprise, John.
No, no, and we should have an episode about that because I was talking to my brother-in-law, and he was going to a conference on open banking last week, and they were talking about all of the agentic interfaces to all of the APIs that exist in the U.S. banking system, and everybody's doing everything to reduce the friction of agents, which increases the security risk of all of the agents that are being concocted these days. So it is a good thing to come back to. And as you mentioned it, it's the RSA conference here in San Francisco this week. I don't know if you noticed yesterday, Carpathy or somebody else found that issue with PyPy. So there is a
Oh
Pi
yeah,
library that for
was it?
3 hours was sending credentials around, and most human beings don't know that updating the PyPy library might be, or LLM library might be happening in the background. They're not even aware of it. It's just
Yeah.
banks or other enterprises cannot let tools change that rapidly.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes down to now have a quick discussion around the broader security model. Not to belabor the point, the security model on the coding agent personal is whatever you give it.
Yeah,
Okay, so it's kind of open season. It is the opposite of what you need on the enterprise, which is a zero trust model. By
yeah,
default, an agent can do nothing. It cannot access any tools. It cannot collaborate with any other agents. In other words, it can do no harm by default. In fact, it can't do anything by default. The second principle is once you actually go beyond zero trust and embody some permissions, you start with a least privileged model.
yeah,
Um, if you don't need it, you don't get it.
yeah,
Those permissions then are and privileges are scoped based off of very rigorous identity and credential management. There's explicit authorization on just about every request that gets issued, and there's probably even policy checks
yeah,
when you actually try and execute sensitive information. Am I allowed to access this customer information? If it's is it a PII? Am I enabled? Is my agent enabled to actually access PII or personally identifiable information? There's a whole raft of capabilities and responsibilities in the security model on the agent harness in the enterprise that is radically different than what we have in the personal or coding agent world.
I remember did you have one other topic you wanted to add to the stack of things we wanted to talk about with respect to harnesses, or have we drained them all?
Well, just one more, and I think it's something
Okay.
that's near and dear to your heart, and then I'll
Oh,
wrap up.
trust.
Trust. How did you know? There you go. Trust is foundational. Now, the trust in the coding agent, personal agent, is
Ah,
implied. Is implied. It's
yes.
implied. I let it do what I want. I trust the agent because they're mine, I suppose. Trust in the enterprise world is it's a cascade of many things, starting with the identity and then the roles and permissions that you're given, all the way to observability, explainability, to things like certification and even governance. All that is a rich stack we call the trust framework that every agent must actually have, John.
So let's save it. Let's do an updated podcast on how we're looking at trust since our last time, because I think it's been 2 or 3 months. And I think there's an evolution in what's happening in the market. And let's come back to that because that's a worthwhile topic. So, and I'll try to cut it here where
I think we're good. I think we're good, buddy.
we've defined all we can about the harness from our perspective of enterprise agents. And like I said last time, things are changing quickly. And if you want to follow what we're seeing in the enterprise agent space, please like and subscribe. Thank you, Eric. Take care.
Take care, John.